there, it's Jessica Honegger, founder of the socially conscious fashion brand Noonday Collection. And this is the Going Scared podcast, where we cover all things social impact, entrepreneurship, and courage. And I'm feeling a little bittersweet about this episode because this wraps up our Imperfect Courage series. For the last 13 weeks, we have gone through chapter by chapter of my new book, Imperfect Courage. We hope that you recommend this series to your friends, post about it, talk about it. It really is meant to go alongside the book. So if you haven't downloaded the book yet via Audible or bought it, make sure you go put it into your cart. It makes for a really great gift going into the new year because it really is about encouraging people to live a life of courage by leaving comfort and going scared. And today's episode is a truly special guest for me because his work has really influenced my thinking. Specifically, he's written a book called Playing God and Strong and Weak. And both of these books really helped create a framework for me around this concept of how do we go about building a flourishing world, which is the title of chapter 12. His most recent book was 2017's The Tech-Wise Family, so he also talks a lot about technology. And Andy has become a mentor and a friend. He is the partner for theology and culture at Praxis, which is an organization that works as a creative engine for redemptive entrepreneurship. It's actually an organization that I have been able to be involved with. And we definitely go deep in this conversation, and he just helps me to see the world differently. And once I see it that way, he gives me a framework to sort of hang my hat on. Sometimes I feel like I have this messy closet going on in my brain, and Andy kind of helps me clean up my clothes and know where to put them. And I just feel a lot more free knowing how to kind of approach my life in a way that will really make an impact. So I'm excited for you to get to hear a little bit more from him today. I was curious because you told me that you've read my book, and I have told you on numerous occasions effusively what an influence you have had on my life. I mean, you've had a huge influence on my thought leader. You played as such a thought leader in my life. And I was just curious, as you were reading my book, could you see reflections of yourself in it? Could you see some of these influences?
I suppose, yes. I mean, I don't know that I was reading it looking for that. But actually, what I was more struck by was how many mutual influences we share, especially Church of the Savior in Washington, D.C., which you had more time with that community, but it's very formative in my own life.
Yeah, tell me about that. I'm so curious about that.
Yeah, when I was a student in undergrad, when I was in college, one of the campus ministries arranged kind of a week-long trip to DC, and it was really my first. Gosh, it was really my first exposure to urban ministry of any kind. And one of our sort of landing places was Church of the Savior, which for those who have not intimately read your book, is this quite extraordinary story of a radically, I would say, intentional group of Christians who basically said, if you're going to be a member of this church, you will, that intrinsically means pouring yourself out in some very distinctive way in service. So this church never had more than, I don't know, a few dozen, maybe 100 members at the very most.
Because it was it required even living in the community. Right. I mean, it was radical, so radical.
So there's almost no Christian community I can think of, certainly outside of maybe some group of monks or nuns, that punched above its weight so powerfully in terms of how few people were actually, strictly speaking, members, and yet how much they did. And so I encountered that in college, and then I was in campus ministry for 10 years and took a group of students.
And where were you? Where'd you go to undergrad?
So I went to Cornell University for undergrad.
That's right.
And then worked with students at Harvard University and took a group of students to DC one year. And we were based at there's a number of congregations connected with Church of the Savior. And it was just a powerful experience. So that was the little community that they had in the Shaw neighborhood, which now is, full of completely renovated brownstones. But at the time was a very, very distressed neighborhood. The neighbors on both sides of this community were drug dealers. The drug dealers actually liked this church very much.
Yeah.
And anyway, it was a glimpse to me of what discipleship could do.
Yeah. I'm so grateful because in my spiritual growth, I never encountered a Christianity that didn't involve being the hands and feet. So I never really went through this oh, okay, this isn't just about, love God, love. It was always, that's what it meant. Even the church I grew up in, they started the first homeless shelter in San Antonio. It's in downtown San Antonio.
Yeah.
And I'm just so grateful for that. And this kind of leads me to my next question, because in chapter 1 of my book, I think it's chapter 1, it might be chapter 2. It went through so many edits that I can't keep up with chapters.
At some point it was chapter 1.
At some point it was chapter 1. And I quote you as talking about the only thing that money can buy is bubble wrap.
Yes.
And of course, the journey that I want my reader to go on in this book, and actually in his or her life, is to acknowledge places where we wrap ourselves in bubble wrap, and how can we rip that off? Yeah. Can you tell me first, so was that a ripping off of the bubble wrap for you? And then tell me more how you've been able to flesh out this in your life.
Well, I think there have been many moments, actually increasingly, I would say, in my life where I've pursued bubble wrap removal projects. and for me, because of where I believe, I hope, where my calling and my, then for 24 years now, my family's calling has taken us, it's always involved displacement, because we lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts for 15 years. This is obviously elite, prosperous city in many ways, not a city without problems, but a comfy place to live. And now we live in Swarthmore, Pennsylvania, which is a super comfy place to live. And it's where we raised our kids with much trepidation, actually. And so I've had to go, the way I think of it is go on pilgrimages frequently. And to me, there's a really important distinction between being a tourist and being a pilgrim. When you go somewhere as a tourist, you go there to be treated better than you're treated at home, to be kind of in an unobtrusive way the center of the world, or to have an experience that sort of elevates you and makes you feel really special. Like, wow, I'm in Florence, or I'm in, Miami Beach, or, whatever your drug of choice is. When you go on a pilgrimage, you go, you may be well treated. Often you're received with incredible hospitality on pilgrimage, but you go because there's something in this other place and in the people who dwell there that you need, that you don't have, that will transform you. So we really don't, for all the rhetoric of tourism about, life-changing experiences on the Riviera or whatever, we go really to be fundamentally affirmed that we are the kind of people who have these experiences. But you go on pilgrimage to be really radically challenged and changed. And certainly that trip to Church of the Savior, or those couple trips, and many, many others, to some extent before and a lot since, are all exercises for me in getting the bubble wrap off for at least a little bit. And I come home and I'm once more, the casing starts to reform, but I try to just constantly be planning to be in places that are going to be difficult for me, that I'm not going to have a lot of competence. I'm not necessarily going to have a lot to offer, but I have a lot to learn. And I trust that, for me as a Christian, that God is there in those places, in some way is willing to meet me in those places in a way that I suppose God is willing to meet me every day, but that I'll never find out about unless I take those journeys. So that's just a habit of my life now.
Well, tell me a little bit about, because I love that. And, Noonday Collection, we actually at a lot of direct sales companies, you actually do win trips to the Riviera.
Yes, right, exactly.
But in our company, you get to win trips to Haiti.
Exactly.
And
I love it.
I love this idea of pilgrimage. And it is, when we go, we're actually getting to know our partners. And it's the very people that are actually creating income opportunities for us in America. So it's this whole equalizing trip, where we're going to go meet the people who, they have a stake on our success and we have a stake on their success. And we do just get to actually celebrate together. We even, actually in Haiti, we even all did go to a beach resort together with the artisans.
Yeah, I remember reading.
Not been on a vacation, because a vacation is a
luxury. Of course.
And I mean that those have been some of my most treasured times. But let's talk about pilgrimage here, because I know even in your life, I mean, don't you play piano for a church of people that maybe don't look just like you? Like, how do we go on pilgrimage here? We don't, I don't want people to mislead people to say you have to go get a passport to go.
No, very
rip the bubble.
Oh, that's so important. Yes. I mean, it's literally down the street. Anyone who's in the U.S. listening to this podcast within a 5-minute drive in some direction probably is an opportunity for this kind of displacement. I mean, you mentioned just in terms of a very formative thing in my life was as a musician. So I'm trained as a musician. I play piano. But in college, I mean, so much happened that was good for me in terms of my growth as a human being and as a follower of Christ. And one thing was ending up apprenticing in a Black church. I am not Black, for those of us who are listening by podcast. I'm super pale. So I literally was formed in the Black church, specifically St. James's AME Zion Church in Ithaca, New York, a small little congregation, who very graciously allowed me to be the piano player for the Zion Harmonizers, which was the junior choir of St. James's AME Zion Church. And the junior choir was anyone under the age of about 55 who wanted to sing. So there was a senior choir, and they had a piano player. She wasn't going anywhere, but they needed someone to play for this slightly younger group. And I said, well, I don't know gospel. I mean, I was trained classically. I loved like popular music and had learned to do some of that on the piano, but I certainly didn't understand like the rhythmic or harmonic vocabulary of gospel. And they said, well, we'll teach you. And very, very graciously, they did. And I did learn something, enough to fool some of the people some of the time, I would say. And much more significantly than the music, really. Well, first, I just got to experience being a minority, which I had honestly not experienced in any sustained way up to that point in my life. I did pick up, like, I love the way that preaching in the Black church is a communal experience, and, the call and response. And I think most people are familiar with that. And I came out of those years at St. James's thinking, why don't I, at least to some extent, participate verbally when someone is pouring themselves out in front of an audience? Like, why not be a little verbal and present? Like, and so it apparently has become kind of famous or notorious or something. And I have people tell me, like, I'll be in a room of hundreds of people, and I'm just in the audience somewhere, and people are like, I knew you were in the room.
Yes, I love it. And I think it was disarming for me because I read your books and I'm like, oh my God, this guy's like smart, heady, but you're actually so warm.
Well, it was very transformative, and all through just pure grace and mercy. I mean, whenever we go into cross-cultural environments, we make mistakes, most of which we never know that we made, because people are very gracious. And so I'm sure there was a lot of that, but there is also a gift of hospitality, not just in the African American church, but in many what we call minority communities. They will increasingly all be minorities, gosh, it was so formative. So yeah, that's where that comes from.
So many times we just need these stories that give us permission to go rip the bubble wrap off by just going and being a minority somewhere. Yeah.
It's important to go as a learner, and I think that was the great opportunity I had. I had a very kind of clear reason I was there in a way. I mean, I was there to learn gospel, yes, to serve by playing, but everyone knew I was there. I had to learn. And that made me, I think, one of the really very challenging things about being white, especially white, shall we say, educated, whatever class that makes you. I'm not sure middle class or upper middle class are that helpful in this context. But one of the challenges we have is that the mediated representations we get of people of color, even today, in 2018, as we're speaking, so often position. How should I put this? They do not position us as learners, and then the relationships that we may have, the kind of glancing relationships or some deeper relationships, we often unconsciously go in with a kind of assumption of superiority. And it's not even, I wouldn't even say in a narrow sense, it's our fault. It's how we're socialized. It's the options we've been given. It's the story that was handed to us, often handed to our own parents and grandparents. Like it's very difficult. And the point is not to assign blame. But you really have to go in as an apprentice, as a novice, as someone who doesn't know, and just learn.
Be curious.
And yes, so curiosity.
And non-judgmental as you are learning.
Yes, exactly. Like I don't, for example, the way I write about this in Playing God, or one of my books, Playing God or Strong and Weak. I think I write about more in Strong and Weak. The way that pastors in the African American church carry themselves. In my cultural context, the most natural word I would tend to assign to that, if I were evaluating it without understanding it, would be it would be something like authoritarian. There's a lot of authority that comes with being the pastor. And by the way, this is one of the unknowing mistakes we so often make in our desire to be friendly. And for us, in a lot of white American culture, friendly means informal. You address that pastor by their first name outside of a friendship relationship, like in a public context. Oh, my friend Richard, or my friend Claude. That's actually very disrespectful in the Black church context. Like this is Bishop Alexander. This is Pastor Richard. Or Pastor Stevens or whatever. And white people, in our desire to sort of act like we're friendly, actually don't honor that position. Now, I could go in and really and judge that and prejudge that. And instead I have to go in and say, okay, this is different from how it's done in my cultural context. But maybe if I stick around long enough, I'll actually learn why it's different. And that doesn't mean that I would give all instances of pastoral authority in the Black church a free pass, because there are times when people abuse this power. But also, by the way, white pastors abuse their informal power all the time. And there's this sort of manipulation that happens through informality, just as there can be a kind of exploitation that happens through formality or formal power. So it's not that I ultimately can't make discernment about how people handle that authority they're given. But it's so easy to go in and just prejudge it. And you have to go assuming there's a good reason things are the way they are in this culture, wherever it is. and I have to first learn and be an apprentice before I'd ever start to be able to perhaps evaluate.
Which is something that's accessible to all of us. I think we know that other cultures have different rules, and we think I'm going to offend or I'm not going to get it right. So I'm just not going to go try this out because I'm just afraid I'm going to hurt someone or be offensive. And the truth is, it's really about, and Tasha talks a lot about this, like, yeah, you are going to offend.
Totally.
Like, that's real. That's going to happen. So it really is about checking your heart and the attitude of your heart. Are you being curious? Are you being a learner? And that's something that we all have access to being.
Totally. And just to drill down on that a bit, first of all, the truth is the offense that I may cause unknowingly is nothing compared to the challenges that people of color live with every day. So it's a drop in the bucket. And they're going to respond in one of three ways. One is it probably will not be folks who have to live with these assumptions that are the assumptions of the dominant culture. They have coping mechanisms, so it may sort of roll off, and they'll just graciously overlook it. That often happens, and you'll never know. The second is it will actually be very troubling, and they won't tell you because they don't trust you. The third best option is that you'll actually get pushback at the right time. And sometimes it'll feel a little abrupt or surprising. And I actually think what we're often afraid of is not offending. It's being confronted with being offending. And yet, if you just stay in the relationship at that point and say, "Oh, I am so sorry. Help me understand. I'm sorry that I have to ask you to help me understand." 95% of the time, on the other side of that, trust is built and relationship is deepened. But we often fear that confrontation, when in fact, that confrontation is an expression of a willingness to go deeper in the relationship. Because if I don't want to go into a relationship with you, I just won't tell you. And but if I tell you, that actually means I'm willing to let you into my world, let you see how my actions, I'm mixing up my pronouns here, but how those offensive actions came to be. Anyway, it's an opportunity to totally learn and actually to experience being loved and forgiven when we didn't deserve it, which seems like pretty good practice.
Yeah. Well, and what I love is what you're saying is it's not just like a one-time, oh, I'm going to go try this out, but it's really committing to a lifestyle of being a stayer, which you proclaimed to me yesterday. Andy interviewed me for his new podcast that's coming out with Praxis, which is an organization I work with that is really creating redemptive entrepreneurship support for entrepreneurs. Yes. And anyway, totally. Andy proclaimed me as a stayer, but that's really what this is. It's about this long-term view. And when you commit to being a stayer, then you're less concerned about being confronted by being offended, because you're like, this is a learning and we're going to wake up tomorrow and we're going to keep at this and I'm going to keep learning. Okay, speaking of yesterday's conversation, which was incredible, y'all, Andy, oh my gosh. I'm much more nervous to interview you today, however, than getting interviewed by you. So I've had to talk myself off of a ledge a little bit. So speaking of being afraid, that's what I wanted to talk about, because Andy was really challenging me on his podcast that, Jessica, you're actually not afraid. Like, I don't know what you're talking about. And I'm like, Andy, I just read a whole book on this. You can't take away this whole thing. But you challenged me to consider that maybe I'm not afraid, but, I said that actually I think you can be afraid and you can exhibit it internally, while externally you might not look afraid. But I'm wondering, what's your relationship to fear? Like, are you one of those that gets more easily paralyzed, or are you one of those that has that bias towards action? I know you are more of a thought leader, but you're loving now at getting to work among entrepreneurs. And you've said to me several times, they have a bias towards action, and I'm loving that. So I want to know a little bit more, like, how do you define courage? What's your relationship to fear?
Oh, man. Well, I certainly love being around people who have a bias to action and people who overcome their fears. I'm not sure if I am one, excessively at least. I mean, I think what immediately comes to mind is the hardest thing I do, which is writing, which probably is the most important thing I do. I don't know exactly how you weigh those things, but I struggle tremendously with paralysis when I am faced with the opportunity or the assignment to write. And it gets worse the bigger the assignment is. So books are by far the worst. My first book was turned in 2.5 years late, I think.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, let's see. It was a beast, though. That was cool. Was that Culture Makers? Culture Making is the first book. Published in 2008, so it was turned in December 2007, I believe, or maybe October 2007. The original due date on the contract that I signed was January 31st, 2005. Yes, so that is 2.5 years late. And I would say, of those 2.5 years, two years of it was fear. Okay. And in fact, the first year, so I signed that contract saying I'd deliver the book January 31st, 2005. I signed that like a year ahead of time. And at the end of that year, so this is a 100,000 word book. I had 3,000 words written at the end of that year, a year in which, by the way, I had no other job. Like, it actually turns out like the worst thing for a writer is to have nothing else to do.
I can see that. I see. I'm more productive when I'm being productive.
Oh, totally. Oh my gosh. When I don't have anything else to do, I just discover unreserved capacity for procrastination. But I was so afraid. I had a very specific fear, actually. And this was a book about culture and how Christians in particular are called to be creators of culture, not just critics of culture. And so I'm writing about an area that a lot of like academics study, especially anthropologists, of course, and sociologists. And I was trying to do a sort of intellectually responsible job of writing about that, even though I have not been trained in either of those fields. And the very specific fear I had, among many, was that a sociologist would read the book when it came out and say, "This is stupid." And I actually had a specific sociologist in mind. And
so you were like writing to this sociologist, basically.
Or not writing.
Or not writing. Right. Well, you weren't writing because you just kept imagining.
Because of imagining.
Yes.
And many other things, but that was certainly one of them. Now, the crazy thing is, a year or two after my book was published, this sociologist did actually publish a book in which he spent 4 pages on my book and in academic prose said, "This book is stupid."
Oh my gosh. So your worst fear did actually exhibit itself.
The very thing I was afraid of happened. Absolutely, like pretty much, I mean, without the use of those exact words, but in academia and in intellectual circles, everyone knows how to say "this is stupid" without using those words. It was an extremely dismissive take on my book. And so what you have to know is that by the time that happened, I was totally free of that. And it didn't matter at all, like at a deep spiritual level. I mean, I wasn't happy about his assessment of the book, but it has not affected the fruitfulness of the work at all. And in one sense, that kind of back and forth is just part of taking a risk as a writer. And what happened is, at the end of that January, when I was supposed to have the whole thing done and had nothing done for all practical purposes, I was at a conference with InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, which I worked with, and 2 of my best friends from my years in campus ministry, I had left that work, but I came back. I think I was doing a seminar or something, and I just happened in the hallway to see these 2 dear, dear friends who had known me at that point for 15 years. And I said, "Guys, I need you to pray for me." I don't know if so what I'm going to recount may sound like freaky for those who may not be Christians, but this is just what happened. And this is the kind of crazy thing we Christians do. So Will and Christina sat down with me behind a potted plant in the hallway of the St. Louis, Missouri Convention Center. And I said, "I just have to confess to you, where I am in this and what I haven't done and kind of why I haven't done it." And they laid their hands on me and prayed for me. And it was, we have this word that we associate specifically with demons, like the forces in the world that most seek to destroy us, and the word being deliverance. And it was that kind of experience. It was very emotional. I was so ashamed of myself for just squandering this year, right? But my friends, they sat with me. I just wept. I mean, it was so truly messy crying, and then they prayed, and then they actually each had things to confess in their own life from their own fears. And so we prayed for one another. And after about 45 minutes of this, we got up and hugged each other. And at least, I think they too, were set free in this very fundamental way. And I went home, and it still took me a year and a half to get the dang thing done.
Because then you had to write a 100,000 word book minus 3,000. Okay.
97,000 words to go. And it's still hard. And there was still procrastination. But I have to say, I was set free at this very deep level by that one intervention from those friends. And they're thanked, of course, in the acknowledgments to the book. And that book was 2.5 years late. Playing God, the book that I think has been meaningful to you, was 1 year late. My 3rd book, Strong and Weak, was 1 month late, or maybe 2 months.
They've also gotten shorter and shorter.
Yes, exactly. Well, yeah, the books have gotten shorter. That's true. But Tech-Wise Family, my last one, was 1 week late. So I'm getting a lot better at facing this. And also I really feel that moment behind that potted plant, which was artificial potted plant, by the way. I can picture it right now. Was the
Yeah.
turning point in my in my life of as
Mhm.
a public voice. Like I would not
Mhm.
have had a voice without that deliverance.
Well, and you had that moment because you had been vulnerable and had been able to share that with your friends, and they received that in a place of empathy. So I think
Yeah.
to quote our friend Kurt Thompson, he would say this is
Yeah.
like the
Oh yeah. Oh my gosh.
neurobiology of the brain,
Totally.
and that's so powerful. And I think
Yeah.
that we often stay paralyzed and we think we're the only one. I mean, we all have. I mean, I've definitely had that, like this person in my head. I do that sometimes when I'm speaking, and maybe I know I'm speaking to some people that maybe are going to disagree, or
Yep.
I've been in some situations, maybe when we're in a tough time as a business, and I'm speaking to maybe some of my critics, and I'll prepare my talk for the critics. It's like I prepare this whole thing and it's really at this place of fear instead of lifting up and walking in faith, which faith is future oriented, and faith leads. I
Yeah.
think fear paralyzes.
Oh, totally. And yeah, I mean, sometimes you're driven, well, often, right? You're driven to that vulnerability that is actually the way out by desperation. I mean, that was my situation. Like I also, we, as you know, for books like this, you are paid in advance as when you sign the contract, or at least a certain amount. I
Yeah.
had spent that money. I was like, I
Right.
can't get that back. I can't refund the publisher.
Right.
Like I have to deliver a book. So desperation sometimes is great at getting us out of that paralysis, but on the other side of it is such amazing freedom. Yeah. And as Kurt would say, being known and knowing that you're loved and you're accepted in your failure to be who you were meant to be, and then somehow you're able to actually be who you were meant to be.
Well, right. And I think sometimes we want to, right, we're outcome oriented. So you're imagining the sociologist, and obviously you're wanting the sociologist praise, not this sociologist, criticism.
Yeah.
And we want to try to control this outcome. And I love in your story, your worst fear came true, because it's not about being able to risk assess the situation so much to where you're like, no, it's actually all going to turn out. I think sometimes when we share fears with our friends, our tendency is to want to say that would never happen, or no. And it's like, actually, that could happen. And then what? And then what? Would you still be loved?
Yes.
Would you still be intact? I mean, Andy, you
Wow.
didn't die. You know what I mean? Like you're alive, and so some of that is just going, your worst fear actually isn't it's your worst fear. It's not what is going to define you. Don't be defined by this failure or this fear of failure, but instead, go scared, the name of the podcast.
Yes, exactly.
So when I read Playing God, it's interesting because we have this saying at Noonday, her success doesn't diminish mine. And
wow, which in a sales organization, that's a big deal.
Yeah. So I wanted to talk about this because when I first started Noonday, I was like hair on fire. I wasn't looking around at competition. I wasn't looking at the marketplace. I had done no competitive analysis. I was just like, I had a boy in Rwanda. I needed money for it. Other women were like, I want to open my house. This is awesome jewelry. And I just started building. And then there came a point where the stakes got a little bit higher. And, I eventually got my business partner, Travis. I told you all about that story yesterday. It's outlined in my book. And suddenly when people are starting to risk on me, I started feeling that a lot more of that fear, because somehow their failure would be linked to my failure would then bring them down. Right. And my success would bring them up. But again, I tend to plan for failure, not success, unfortunately. And so then I started looking around a lot more, and kind of probably was a little obsessive. Like maybe it was this sociologist moment for me where I'm like looking at, a couple of other artists and businesses. This was, several years ago. There was not a whole lot actually on the landscape, and I would follow them. And honestly, I think what I ultimately felt was, was it jealousy? Was it competition? Ultimately, was it wanting what they had, and when we want what someone else has, we actually aren't focused on what we do have, right?
Yes.
And it can be so distracting.
Wow.
And I had such this moment after reading your book of that idea of power, and it's not a zero-sum game.
Yes.
And this brand, these other two brands that I was eyeing, their success actually wasn't diminishing mine. Like it was taking nothing away from the success of Noonday.
Yeah.
And I can remember decisively, because I read the book and I was like, I got to hear more of this guy. And I think I listened to some sort of talk you gave on the book. And I remember sitting in the parking lot of our office and just crying and going and asking God for forgiveness that I had really seen power and success as the zero-sum game.
Yep.
So I wanted us to talk a little bit about, first of all, your philosophy around power, multiplying power, flourishing power, and then how do we reconcile that now that you're working with entrepreneurs where we very much do have to look at the consumer pie, and we do kind of need to take into consideration what is our competitive analysis, what's our competitive advantage. And I know these things you haven't fully fleshed out, but I've asked you to. I'm like, could you please write a book on this? But let's first lay the groundwork for whatever that moment. I can't even tell you what exactly it was that I read specifically. I just remember there was just this idea that power is not the zero-sum game, and that more equals more. And I realized I've been living in this scarcity mentality.
Right. Well, yeah. So I think the key fundamental idea here is that there is a kind of power that is a zero-sum game, and it's force. It's compulsion, coercion, ultimately violence, right? And this involves making someone or something do something they don't want to do, or that they resist doing. And it can at the physics level, it can be just like closing a door, like the door resists with a certain amount of inertial something or other. I'm not a scientist, but right. And so it's pushing against resistance, and that is a zero-sum game. Like actually, it's very humid here today, and our front door barely closes. Like to close it, I have to use a lot of force, almost a level of violence. I'm tempted to use a lot of violence against my front door. Actually, I'm frustrated with it, and either the door wins or I win. And like that is zero-sum.
That's zero-sum.
Yeah. And literally actually it's slightly negative sum. If you want to do deep physics, second law of thermodynamics says every exchange like that actually slightly increases the disorder in the world, energy that's not available for work. So like every time you lay out some energy to get something to happen, you actually diminish cosmically the remaining energy available. So force is a contest in which only one party can win. Either I can make you do something or you can make me do something. But there's a completely different kind of power, which is the power to bring something into being that does not exist. And I would call that creative power instead of coercive power. So coercive power is the ability to get stuff that already exists to do what I want. And that's a limited quantity.
Which I would say, obviously, that's pretty much defines injustice, right? Is the negative use of power.
Yes.
Coercive use of power.
Absolutely.
Which I just remembered, we're actually going to see each other this weekend, aren't you? I'm speaking at Liberate. I just remembered that. Like we are getting so much of each other this week. This is hilarious.
It's awesome. Much overdue, I'll say. Yeah. So all injustice. So all injustice ultimately deploys violence. So violence is force that violates the dignity of another. So if I get really mad at that door and I slam it violently, I'm using more force than necessary to get it to do what I need it to do. And I'm kind of violating its design. And I'm actually violating myself too, right? It would be embarrassing in some sense to have someone see me get mad at my front door just because it's sticking. Because I'm stepping out of the bounds of what is to be a healthy human being and what is in this case to be a healthy door. Now that's not that big a deal if it's a door, it's a big deal if it's another human being. And all injustice violates. That is, it denies the dignity of someone else, often in order to achieve its coercive aims. And yes, so that's the very essential pattern of injustice and violence. Creativity, on the other hand, creation is not limited in this way. So a very simple example is that we're having a conversation now, and because we're really listening to each other, and because we are creative people, and I don't mean we're creatives like some people are creative, some are not. We're like people who are creative. All people are.
All people.
And
listen to that, listeners. You are
yes,
creative. You're created in the image of God to be
yes.
creative.
Yes. I hate it when people talk about creatives. I mean, I understand
I
when we
know.
name that profession, but no. Every human being, as we listen to each other, we use the English language, which is a finite resource. That is, we're not making up any words in this conversation. We're not changing the rules of grammar at all. And yet, I guarantee each of us has spoken a sentence in this conversation that we have never spoken before. And in fact, linguists say we have spoken a sentence that has never been spoken in the history of the English language. So we have made something new out of limited resources. Like, we aren't making up some new language, but we're rearranging it in a creative way that brings into being something that, if we do it well, is worthwhile. And that to me is like a picture of what can happen with all of creation. It is finite. Like, there's only so much stuff in the world, and we can't make more of it. But when we relate to the world creatively rather than coercively, there's actually so much room to bring value into the world. And among other things, you put this in a business context, business in one sense is just the recognition of value and the exchange of tokens of value. And it's the fundamental human creativity that means that there is no clear ceiling on how much we can create and how much value we can add to the world when we do it creatively rather than coercively. So the way this applies to, so you're starting a direct sales business, or, I think it's obviously what you do is so much bigger than that, but one could reduce it to that, or a jewelry business, or, you could use any number of reductive kind of pictures, right? And then you look at the competitive landscape, you're like, well, there's lots of other people trying to do that. And when you have a coercive mindset, you think, how can we take market share from that other business?
Which is a very common way to, is that Jeff Bezos, he actually doesn't believe it. He doesn't look at his competition. Isn't that his philosophy?
It may well be. I haven't heard that, but I wouldn't be surprised, because in fact, now it may well be the case that over time, some ventures become more viable and others become less viable, but not really, not in a healthy environment by going out and like grabbing, because that's so uncreative. Like, and by the way, where that does happen is in what we call in economics commodities. So commodities are things that are indistinguishable from one another. One is just as good as another. Essentially, that's to say there is no creativity involved in their production. They're often extracted. They're natural resources of different kinds often. And when you're in a commodity business, it is zero sum. Whoever can sell at the lowest market clearing price gets the market share. But the whole goal of business actually is to not merely be in the commodity business. And it's to actually add value. And when you do that, ideally, you do it in spaces that have nothing there. So you don't so much look at your competitors and think, how can I beat that person? You ask, and this is where competitive landscape analysis is absolutely the right thing to do. You ask, what's just missing? Like, what doesn't even exist yet that we could create? And the amazing history of the last 120 or 200 years is over and over people realizing there's this whole realm that's missing that innovation allows us to create space in. And it doesn't so much displace or coerce as simply open up possibility. Now, I don't want to deny, there's another level at which economics functions, there are elements of scarcity, right? And that happens in business, and we have a lot fewer people, making wagon wheels.
But like let's take Walmart.
So Walmart kind of famously competes on price. They don't compete on creativity, right? They compete on squeezing. I would say, with all respect to Walmart, and there's lots of good things about being an efficient business, but their whole company culture is efficiency. But that actually leaves so much room for other kinds of companies whose company culture is something other than mere kind of squeezing waste out, who actually create something. And so yes, Walmart did displace less efficient competitors for sure, but it also contributes. Well, at the same time, I'm not going to say that Walmart's the cause of it, but at the same time, there's this economy that is growing in all kinds of other dimensions that Walmart can't touch. So
that's so true. It's this whole idea of there's different lanes,
Yes.
and run in your lane.
And because it would be like we said, this podcast could this podcast eventually dominate all other podcasts, right? Well, in one sense, people only have so much time to listen, right? So in one sense, there is a competitive landscape. People are listening to us rather than something else they could be listening to. But really what's going on here is you are curating a set of conversations in which new things are said that have never been said before, that couldn't have been said unless you took the risk of calling me up and Tasha and all your other guests and saying, would you spend an hour, which is scarce, and out of that scarce hour and out of our listeners' time, could we create something that doesn't exist? And the truth is, like, this is exactly the right thing to do. And there's no, that creative aspect, there's no coercion involved, and there's no sort of domination involved. It's just opening up new possibilities.
I'm in love with this. And Andy, I struggle and I'm trying to identify, because I'm a creator, right? Well, we all are creators, but so I have this bias towards action. I go and do, but then somewhere along the way, it's like when I launched my book, and I launched a book tribe a couple months before the book. And these are my advocates that were going to go and bring it to market. And 2,000 women signed up. And I just remember feeling absolutely humbled. And I was like, if you guys are the only ones that read my book, like this, like, I am grateful. And, then one of my mentors, Brene Brown, read the book and endorsed the book. And I was just so humbled. And I thought, this is better than the New York Times. Like, this is beautiful. This is wonderful. And I had all of this, like, I'm just offering gift. I'm offering my life as gift. I'm offering, it's all just gift. And then the book launched. And then suddenly I'm like looking at the Amazon list. I'm like, we're going to take that person down. Like, I was like, I want to be on the New York Times bestseller.
Yes,
besides, my book is rescuing women out of brothels. My book is bringing justice to the world. My book can help people get off their couch and go change the world. It matters so much more than those 5 top bestsellers, which, by the way, means I should be doing better. And by the way, God, you better make my book do better.
Oh, my gosh.
My joy in a time when you think this should be joy, right? It should be like, finally it's birthed. It's been like almost this 3-year process, between inception to birth. And I am sad and not celebrating. And I'm feeling like, I got 24 on that list, but I didn't get 5.
Totally.
And thankfully I realized, but even realizing it though still didn't mean, it just took a long time. I'm just now settling in. We're a few weeks in. Actually, ironically, this is the last podcast in this whole Imperfect Courage series. You are my final guest for these beautiful 12 podcasts. This is the chapter building this flourishing world. And there's just this push-pull, like we start something and it's beautiful and we're doing it for the love of it. But then suddenly, for me, not for all people, I don't know if this is in my personality or what, but like then suddenly it becomes about the outcome and not about the journey. And then I'm suddenly looking at everyone else's lane and I'm thinking my lane matters more, so it should be bigger and better. Break it down for me, Andy. How does this fit? Like, I know.
Gosh. I could totally break it down. And I've been there. I will say, gosh, I'm so grateful that I imposed a discipline after my first book of never looking at those Amazon numbers, or any of those other numbers. Because I know exactly what you have been through.
So that's a real practical thing I could do, because I still look at them every day.
Oh, never. For so many reasons, but let me give you the most fundamental. This is in our founding story. So God creates, right? In Genesis 1, whether you believe it literally or take it as a kind of deeply instructive myth, it doesn't really matter for my purposes right now. God creates this abundant world, day after day, brings into being things that are not, places image bearers, male and female, in that world, in this abundant environment of a garden, right? And says, now it's your turn, in a way, to imitate me as creator. Into that garden, somehow, comes a serpent who says, I notice a limitation in this garden. You're not allowed to touch that or eat from that tree. And the woman's like, yeah, we're not even allowed to touch it. which God didn't actually say. And the serpent says, you know why? It's because God is in the zero-sum game. And God knows, if you eat that tree, you will be like God. And the serpent says this as if it's a bad thing, as if it's something God is afraid of. God definitely does not want any competition in his cosmos. So the serpent's like, but God knows if you eat it, he's going to have competition and you'll be just like him. And the woman's like, well, the interesting thing is they are like God. They're made in God's image. It's actually something that in a way they should want. But what she hears and what the man hears and what human beings have heard ever since is God is in the zero-sum business. And if I'm not going to be ground down by a dominating God who just wants to put limits on me and prevent me from being what I'm meant to be, I have to disobey and dominate myself. And ultimately, as Nietzsche said, I'm going to eventually have to kill God if I could. And it's a lie. It's absolutely a lie, because for the whole rest of the Hebrew and Christian scriptures, God never responds in kind. He's not in this game. He's not in the competitive game. And for those of us who are Christians, God ultimately submits himself entirely to his creation. Instead of us becoming like God, God becomes like us. And even is not afraid of death, which is, of course, the thing that haunts all of this whole story. Now, what is the thing that is most scarce? Now, time is very scarce, but there's something that's even more scarce, and it's status. And status is your place in line. And only one person can be first in line. And that's the very, very dangerous power of all those lists, is they rank order books, but really we people read them as ranking people, and our worth is people. And the only way for me to climb that list is for someone else to decline, right? And it's so interesting that Jesus was very engaged with the world around him in all kinds of ways, but the one thing he showed no interest in at all was status. He's in a town, the ruler of the synagogue, most important man in the town perhaps, comes to him with a need. His daughter is ill. Jesus is ready to go with him, but then along comes this woman. She's been a total exile from the community because she's been bleeding for 12 years. She just touches the hem of his cloak. He doesn't even initially know who it is. And he's just as interested in her as he is in this very high status man. And he ends up meeting both of their needs and talking with both of them and deeply engaging with both of them. James and John, the two disciples, come and they're like, Jesus, could you arrange for us to be in places number 1 and number 2 at your messianic banquet? And Jesus is like, do you know what you're asking? And then he says, I don't even know who's going to be in those places. And he just doesn't even care. He's like, that's for whoever the Father has decided to put. I don't even pay attention to that. He's sitting at a dinner with his disciples where normally the lowest status person in the room would have to, and ideally, quote unquote, it would be a slave, right? An enslaved person or someone very, very low status would come around and wash everyone's feet from the dirty road. But if there wasn't a slave in the room to do it, whoever was like the most junior, everyone would do a sort of a mental accounting, like, oh, I think that's, Matthew's job or whatever. And all the disciples are too proud to wash each other's feet. So they sit apparently through most of the dinner with unwashed feet, which for us would be like picking your nose and then not washing your hands, right? But everyone's too proud to do it. Jesus gets up after dinner, takes off his robe, ties a towel around his waist, and goes around and washes everyone's feet because he doesn't care because he's not in that game. He's in the creative game. And in the creative game, there's no such thing as, is my sentence better than your sentence? Because you've said beautiful, important things as we've talked. I've hopefully said some beautiful, important things. There's no competition between the things we've said. We've added to the world, and we've actually together added something we never would have added on our own. And Jesus, all he cares about is creativity. And so this is why it's really, all this means, don't look at the Amazon number.
I'm crying right now because it's been a thing. And
it's so real.
It's so real. And I'm crying on behalf of all the listeners right now. And maybe it's not about a book for them, but it's about something like
all of us.
And so is it even this isn't necessarily where because I have this beautiful way to wrap this up, and it's how you describe a flourishing world. But is it possible then to be competitive? Like, can that language exist? Or you know what I mean? Like, is that something that we as faith-oriented people, and I'm also crying because, you know, that part in my book at the end where Richard Foster, who is this Quaker theologian, I'm 21 years old. I'm attending this retreat of his. I'm about to go overseas with Food for the Hungry. And he did not know me from Adam. This guy does not know me. And he asked if people wanted prayer at the end. And I'm thinking, God, this is kind of Pentecostal, but I'm like, sure. Like, I wasn't expecting a Quaker to be wrapping it up like this. So I'm like, well, I'll get prayer from this guy. I mean, my gosh, he wrote, you know, the Celebration of Discipline, just deep spiritual, you know, framework.
Very high status. I'm sure his prayers matter, especially to God, because of.
Well, that's right. That's right. So I'm in line. Anyway, he just starts talking to me, and then he looks at me and he says, "Never scorn the rich and never glorify the poor.
Wow.
Just walk in the Holy Spirit. Be like Mother Teresa, whether she was in India with a leper or whether she was in the White House with the president. It didn't matter."
Wow.
And so as you're talking, like, of course, prophetically, this has played out in my life. My entire business is about bridging rich and poor and creating connection and meaning. Goodness. But really, I could almost summarize what he said is like, don't care about status, you know?
Yes.
But it's so easy to say, don't care about status, right? Like, it's like a rule. Like, we all know, be like Jesus, you know? But what I love what you're saying is the solution to that is stepping into this story of creation, of being that co-creator. Like, I mean, would you say that is what the invitation that you're holding out to us?
Absolutely. And you asked about competition, and you know, and there's purpose to competition for the development of us. Like my son wants to be a musician. He competes against other musicians in auditions and so forth. It's a way of pushing yourself to be your best. But the goal is the goal is to be able to say of our lives, it was very good. So this is what God says at the end of his own act of creating in Genesis 1. God saw everything had made, including the man and the woman, and said, it's very good. And that is an evaluation, right? So it's not like we become indifferent to our lives, to the fruit of our lives, to what we've made of our lives. I'm not indifferent to that 2.5 years well, not all of it, but much of it wasted. I would say that was a waste. That was not very good. I regret that. Fortunately, I feel totally forgiven and free of that failure, but it was a failure. And so I'm not competing primarily against other authors. I am competing in a way against, actually, in a way, the voice of scarcity, the voice of competition that paralyzes me, and that says, well, why don't you just do something mediocre so you won't even pretend you're trying to be excellent? Or, you know, there's so many different forms this takes. But the what we press toward and what we arrange our lives to push us toward and train. I mean, Paul, the apostle, says, I mean, he uses strong language. He says, I beat my body to get it into shape so I'll be able to run this race that at the end of my life, I'll be able to say, this was very good. And that's not, this was better than what Jessica did. It's no, what came into the world because of my life and the people that God gave me to partner with brought something into the world that fulfilled the Creator's original intention, that his world would be opened up and all of its possibilities would be explored. And that is not something in which I'm fundamentally competing with others. It's something in which I'm actually having to shed and lay aside that idea that I am here to win, and instead realize I'm here to bring a kind of flourishing that if I don't take a risk, if I don't act, it will never be. And yet if I do, thanks to the ultimate rescue of all things by the one who will renew all things, it will actually matter. And it will have brought something into the world that wasn't there before.
And we can get to say those words very good. Whereas if we're paralyzed by not being number one, or by what that other person might say about us, or that this other person is not going to perceive us as not as smart, or the sociologist, or whatever it might be, we'd never get to hear those words.
It's so different from not good enough, which is what you'll hear eternally, in a sense, if you set up that comparison. It is just, I mean, the At the very beginning of Jesus' public life, this voice comes from heaven. This is my beloved son in whom I'm well pleased. He hasn't even done anything. God is just pleased to be in a relationship with him. And then the promise at the end is, well done, good and faithful servant. Enter into the joy of your master. And, there's this one parable where people have been working different amounts, like they technically should have earned different amounts. And the owner of that vineyard just pays everyone the same thing. And some complain. They're like, hey, well, I worked all day. And God's like, well, what is that to you? I gave you what you most want, which I think outside the terms of that little parable is, what do I most want? It's to know that my life mattered. It's to know that I participated in creating something very good, that I was ultimately who I was created to be. And that is the reward. Nothing else. And there's nothing else on offer, actually, than God saying, well done, good and faithful servant, at the end of our lives.
This is such a beautiful way to wrap up this series and this chapter, which is called Building a Flourishing World. And I love how you say that a flourishing world is a world where every creature can be fully, truly, gloriously itself, most of all, where God's own image bearers bear that image in all its fullness, variety, and capacity. And it is such a beautiful story that we're invited into, and then we get to invite others into and bring this flourishing to the slums of India.
Totally.
To the brothels of Beijing, to the disparities that exist in Uganda. And we get to create these spaces where other people can be gloriously themselves. So thank you. Thank you for your writing. Thank you for not staying paralyzed. Because I know I certainly have gotten to really lean into a framework that's so rich in the way that you have created your words for me and for countless others.
Oh, thank you, Jessica.
So Andy definitely caught me in the middle of just my own processing around this idea of how can we be ambitious, but do it in a way that is joyful and freeing. And I just love this idea that her success doesn't diminish mine, and that creativity is regenerative and it's abundant. And I really want to live from that place. It's such a beautiful way to wrap up this entire series. You can keep up with Andy via andycrouch.com. And just before you go, I just want to thank you so much, truly. My Imperfect Courage listeners, it's been such a joy to meet so many of you. By the time you hear this, I will have wrapped up my last book stop of 2018. I love hearing from you. I love reading your reviews. So I would love for you to go leave a review on iTunes and tell me what you've learned from this series of Imperfect Courage. Let iTunes know about it so that other people can find this, and we can all build a world that flourishes together. Our wonderful music for today's show is by my good friend Ellie Holcomb, and the Going Scared podcast is produced by Eddie Kolpoltz. And I'm Jessica Honecker. Until next time, which is a whole new series, let's take each other by the hand and keep going scared.